welcome everyone. I'm Melissa Scanlon. I'm the director of the Center for Water Policy and a professor at UW-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Sciences. We have been coordinating the Freshwater Collaborative's water policy network across the universities of Wisconsin. And this has been these webinars that we host during the semesters. It's a way for us to bring together network members to discuss people's current research, but also understand different research methods. So it's interesting when we look across the membership of the Water Policy Network, people are in all different departments and they're using so many different research methods that we find these sessions throughout the semester where we're featuring different researchers to be really helpful to better understand the approaches that people are using and to think about potential future collaborations we might do across disciplines and perhaps go in together on grant proposals to solve pressing water policy issues that really are oftentimes wicked problems that require a lot of different ways of thinking to address them. So welcome to this one, and I'm going to turn things over to Anna Watson, and she will introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Nice to all see you. My name is Anna Watson, and I am a Sea Grant UW Water Science Policy Fellow, in addition to also being a water policy specialist here at the Center for Water Policy. And part of my role is that I am the coordinator for the Freshwater Collaborative Water Policy Network this year. And I'm excited today to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Beth Tellman. Beth is an assistant professor at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at UW-Madison. And prior to becoming a faculty member there at UW-Madison, Beth obtained her PhD in geographical sciences from Arizona State University. Her research seeks to address the causes and consequences of global environmental change with a focus on flood risk and land use changes as well. She engages in multiple disciplines and methods to understand and map the causes and consequences of vulnerability. And Beth is here today to speak about some of this research and discuss how she has utilized satellite data to understand flood risks. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Beth.
All right. Thanks so much for that introduction. Excited to meet folks here. And as Melissa said, think about what are other people doing in this space and what are the things that we can build together. And I'm especially interested to connect with other people who are working on floods and flooding issues, and especially folks that are working locally here in Wisconsin. I'll sort of talk more about this later, but I love doing community engagement work and transdisciplinary work outside academia. And it's easiest to do that when you're local and can have lots of meetings and face-to-face interaction and building relationships and trust with communities and groups and neighborhoods. And so I'm really eager to get involved in that kind of work. If anyone kind of sees interest or potential somewhere you're working, or you think, oh, satellite data could do something interesting here, please ping me, because that's some of the stuff that I'm the most excited to do and got really excited talking to Eric about a couple weeks back as I transition to this new state, which unfortunately has a lot of flood problems. So more than enough things for me to work on locally here in Wisconsin, and getting worse, as you all know. So with that preamble, I'll share some slides. And it's nice that we're a small group. I'll try to keep this to about 30 minutes. Anna, do you usually have people ask questions at the end, or do you guys have more casual sort of conversation and questions during the talk?
We usually save them until the end.
Okay. All right. Well,
Yeah.
then I'll go for about 30 minutes
Okay.
and try to leave lots of time for a question and discussion to go back. I'm new here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I sit in the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And in this center, for sustainability and the global environment. And my lab group, we call ourselves the Social Pixel Lab, and I'll describe, and you'll have more of an intuition for what that means, hopefully by the end of this talk. But really, we use a lot of satellite data and remote sensing to understand how the Earth is changing and what we can do about it to make human life better for people on this planet. So that's why we have sort of both the social and the pixel part together. Almost everybody in my group is doing a combination of both social science and remote sensing in some capacity. That's what we do. I got really involved in the kind of work that you'll hear about. And I've been trained really as this sort of satellite obsessed geographer because I lived in El Salvador and did flood rebuilding and reconstruction and started a nonprofit with community leaders there. And so did that on the ground work for many years. And the dynamics that I saw and lived there in those communities and questions we had at the time of like deforestation and land change, was that leading to flooding? And seeing mostly informal settlement communities that were urbanizing along waterways being affected the most, and why did those people have to live there and had to make that choice to live in that location and couldn't live somewhere else, to seeing so many issues with the politicization and even corruption of disaster recovery and aid really not reaching people who needed it the most when a disaster would happen. All of these dynamics that I saw living in El Salvador has really defined the research questions that I study now. And I've been looking at land use change, both in deforestation and urbanization, mostly in the US, Mexico and Central America, and flooding issues really ever since that time over the past decade. So that's really what motivates me, and sort of my deepest questions come from that experience. And so my lab, to look at these human environment questions, we have to combine a lot of methods. We both use satellite data to look at what's happening across a large landscape and area to understand change. We use social science, both qualitative and quantitative techniques, and also pull on a lot of hydrology because we're studying flooding, and that's really important to the topic of most of what's going on in the lab. So that's just kind of an overview of what we do in our approach. I'm going to talk about kind of one thread through a lot of our projects and just show a couple of things that are interesting in the lab right now, or that we've done recently, which is trying to understand flood risk in an urbanizing world. So I'll show some of our approaches of using machine learning and satellite data to understand where is flood exposure growing right now and what do we see with satellites. Trying to understand where or who is shaping where urban growth takes place. So I'll talk a little bit about a project I have in that realm. And then most importantly, how can we adapt? I don't just want to understand and quantify flood problems. I'm really interested in building solutions. And so I'll talk a little bit about flood insurance and a company that I started that works with insurance companies to provide innovative insurance solutions. And I'll also talk about environmental justice work I've been doing on the US-Mexico border and sort of this community engagement piece to think about how we can use satellite data to address flood injustice and catalyze more adaptation. So that's the agenda and the overview. The reason I'm so into satellite imagery is because there's a lot of it and there's more of it every single year. It's hard to keep up with the number of satellites that are launched, increasingly now in the commercial sector, that are giving us more and more images of the Earth every day. And we can map water and where floods have happened in those images. And that's really useful. Flood models are also useful, and they can estimate a probability of a flood occurring, but it's really great to have this observation of where did the water actually go, which tends to be much more accurate in reconstructing the past and can tell you some things about risk that maybe aren't coming through in a traditional physically based model. So that's the piece that my lab really works on. And we use machine learning to do it just because it's the best way for us to get the most information out of every image and synthesize images together. If you've never seen a satellite image in a flood map before, I wanted to start by showing you like what does this actually look like? What does water look like in a satellite image? These are two images, before on the left and after on the right, of a flood along the US-Mexico border in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. This is from a commercial sensor called PlanetScope. And what you're looking at, if you're not a remote sensing person, is what's called a false color composite. So here, vegetation actually looks really red, and water is going to look kind of blue or really dark. And so these kind of blue and dark areas is what we're looking for with water. All of this red is kind of agricultural areas and vegetation. And then kind of these areas you see in sort of brown or white, these are going to be roads or homes here. So these like little dots are houses. This is a 3 to 5 meter spatial resolution imagery. And we have kind of images like this from floods in a bunch of places across the US. And I have a link kind of below if folks want to check out the app we have on Google Earth Engine that we've used in a previous symposium. But what we see here in the flood is all of this kind of water from this main riverway kind of spilling out over here in these teal and dark areas. And in particular here, this community was really affected. All of these darkened areas you see, this is water flooding. In this case, these are many manufactured homes and informal communities outside of the zoned urban area around McAllen, Texas. And what we try to do is use AI to extract what that water footprint was in this neighborhood, so we can see what were the homes and the people that were affected. So this is kind of an example of extracting that flood footprint map. And what happens is when we compare, what happened in this one event in June 2018 to the FEMA maps, two things pop out. One is this county, this is Hidalgo County, Texas, never had any digitized FEMA flood map. They still don't. So there is no FEMA flood map available to compare with what happened in this event. And the other county to the right hugely underestimates the amount of water from a 100-year floodplain, which is what the FEMA map, regulatory map represents more or less, to the amount of water that actually happened in this large flood event. So big differences there in how you might think about looking at risk. If we take another map, this is from the First Street Foundation. These are the data that are, I think they're now in Redfin, and there's a website called Flood Factor, if you've ever heard of these websites. These are kind of the fancier commercial flood models that are behind those websites. If you look at the 100-year floodplain from that flood model, you can see that it really underpredicts, again, in this same community, a lot of the flooding that we can easily see in the satellite image that the AI algorithm is picking up on, but that the flood model really underpredicts. And we commonly see this all the time. Part of it is because it's really hard to update flood models. This is a rapidly urbanizing area. Drainage networks are shifting all the time. Impervious surface is growing. But also, it's just really hard to estimate pluvial flooding. So the kind of flooding that happens when there's too much rain ponding on the surface, it's really hard to predict that in many flood models, and we can see that really well in satellite imagery. So this kind of urban pluvial flooding we see in this community, flood models have a really hard time picking that up. So that's the value, kind of the reason why I like to use satellite imagery to take a different picture of risk. So in addition to PlanetScope, which is the one example I showed, my lab uses many other sensors. I'm not going to go into more detail here, but if you have questions, I'm happy to. And we have different algorithms and publications on the techniques that we use to map water from all of these different sensors. And they have a lot of different advantages, which is why we like to use so many. Water moves really fast, and so you have to use as many satellites as possible if you want to catch it where it is. So I won't go into more depth here, but suffice to say, many sensors. I want to give some intuition for how does the AI part of extracting water from images work, and why does it work so well? So I won't go into further depth than this slide, but if you have questions, happy to go dig in deeper. The main technique that we're using in my lab is called convolutional neural networks. This is really popular and common in modern remote sensing. And here's how it works. I'm going to give you kind of the intuition of how it worked in facial recognition technology, which is where this came from. So the idea is that this algorithm is running a series of convolutions over different scales of an image to save useful features. So I'm going to show kind of this an example of a human face. If you look at sort of these lower level simple features, the first features that might get saved are like the curves and bright and dark spots that pop out in an image. And if you upsample or upscale from those kind of features, the algorithm might start to put together, okay, these common patterns like eyes or nose or ears, where you see sort of those curves connecting, and then upsampling even further, you start to get this recognition of a human face. So we have these features that build at these different scales, and this is all happening in the background through just doing matrix math on pixels that preserve these spatial patterns. Well, it turns out this is a really, really effective way of identifying water in an image, because it's not just looking at what does water look like in that one pixel, but what is surrounding that pixel and what are these meta features on the landscape that might tell us, yes, that pixel is water. So for example, water looks really different in an agricultural field here than a braided channel system, than a really large delta. And what machine learning allows us to do is kind of build these specific thresholds for these really different water use cases, if you can train the algorithm with enough examples to do that. So my lab has spent a lot of time hand curating many data sets that are now public and open source that other people use as well to try to train algorithms to just make the best flood map possible to extract that water footprint. And this is an example of what some of that process looks like. So here again is a PlanetScope satellite image. This is an example of our lab like hand painting in water in these images and then applying that to train an algorithm to predict water on another image. And what we found, for example, is that if we use this commercial data from PlanetScope, we can increase accuracy by quite a bit. And so one of the things that we've done recently is release this data set of our hand labeled images from commercial imagery for free that anyone else can use. And they can use that data and make a much better flood map on a public image without having any access to a commercial image license. So that's the kind of thing that we like to do. And when we make algorithms on satellite imagery and look at a lot of flood maps, we can see things that flood models wouldn't predict. So if you kind of remember in my earlier example, showing that we see all this water that wasn't showing up in the flood models, if we do that analysis globally, which my lab has done, what we find is that flood exposure is actually growing 15 to 20% faster than population is growing. So people are actively moving and rebuilding in floodplains faster than they're building anywhere else. And that this is 8 times the rate that a flood model predicted. So there is something important that we're seeing about risk and exposure that a satellite image can tell us and show us that isn't always appearing in the flood models that we have at national and global scales. This project that we did globally was called the Global Flood Database. This is also open access data. We have 913 large flood events. We use the MODIS satellite to map all of these. And there's a visualization tool, and folks can go in and download any image from this event. Most of the events that we mapped, you can see are really heavily concentrated in Southern Asia. And what we found when we looked at all of these flood maps around the world is that there were really different patterns in population change. So in places like New Orleans, this is panel A, this is the footprint from Hurricane Katrina. We see population numbers have declined in places that flooded during Katrina and actually moved out. Those are these pixels in blue. But in other places around the world, Dhaka, Bangladesh, Guwahati, India, what we actually see is places that have flooded in the past have increased a lot in population. These are the areas in red. And so we were able to look at this on a global scale and show that somewhere our estimates are between 60 to 80 million people moved into places that we saw flood on a satellite image in a period of just 15 years, between 2000 and 2015. So those are the kind of analytics you can do when you combine satellite data with social science data like population and look at changes over time. Anyone can go and download a flood map from our database, and we have this sort of interactive display where you can pick any country in the world, and it'll show you the timeline and all the floods we have and other data for that event. And people have used this data to do a lot of really interesting things, from estimating new estimates of infant mortality to look at effectiveness of flood-tolerant rice varieties in Bangladesh, and many, many other examples. I can't even keep track of how people are using this data. But it sort of begs a deeper question. Like, everybody knows flood risk is increasing. We see this in the news all the time. We know that there are more rapid rates of urbanization and the highest levels of flood risk. But why is this happening? And what can we do about it? So kind of the three main causes for me, and that we see a lot in the literature, are urbanization of floodplains, climate change actually growing the flood footprint of where water is. We're seeing unprecedented events like I think happened in Milwaukee this summer, but also a lot of social reasons. Structural racism and inequality shape exposure, where people can live. Who is the most vulnerable to floods, and who ends up recovering or adapting? So all of these reasons are important, but I'm just going to talk about this first one of urbanizing in floodplains in the US with my newest project. And I got really interested in this after Hurricane Harvey. There was excellent investigative journalism after Hurricane Harvey showing that there were all of these people like shocked that their home was in a floodplain. And what came out after that story was that people in many cases did not know. And there were all sorts of kickbacks happening between government officials, real estate companies, and engineers that was really hiding this information from people. And so I got interested in how does this actually happen? How are we reshaping floodplains and flood information that may be hiding true risk from people who get caught surprised? And so in order to do that, I have a National Science Foundation funded project. It was my NSF career project, which got terminated, but we did recently get some new funding from an eager project with a slightly changed name that didn't have words like justice or adaptation in it, and are now calling this satellite-based evaluation of US flood mitigation infrastructure performance. And what we're doing is looking and seeing where regulatory floodplains from FEMA have been changed and reduced in the US. And were those reductions justified? Did flood exposure actually decrease when somebody redrew the FEMA floodplain? This often happens because a real estate developer wants to do a development. They would like to increase the value of that land. And what they'll do is say, I'm going to build this levee or culvert and show this engineering study and ask for the FEMA floodplain to be moved back. But are those mitigation infrastructures that real estate developers claim they're doing, do they actually happen? And do they really reduce flood exposure for that neighborhood? Or are they sometimes pushing that flood exposure down to another neighborhood downstream? We hear stories about this and see stories about this all the time from investigative journalists, but I wanted to study this systematically across the US. So we're systematizing all of the FEMA flood map changes, and then we're using satellite data to see, did it flood in the places that changed or didn't it? And were those changes justified? That's the essence of our project. I'm going to tell you one story to paint more of a picture of this, of how this process unfolds in Houston, Texas, which is where one of the many places this happens. So on the left, you're looking at the FEMA regulatory floodplain from 2007. This is an area in northwestern Houston. Zone AO is a 100-year floodplain. But Metro National, a real estate development company, wanted to build in this area. And so they wanted to restrict the floodplain from this gray area kind of to this smaller floodway in these sort of red and blue hatches. And so they hired engineers, ran studies, requested that FEMA reduce that area so that they could then build these developments. Well, what was later found by investigative journalists and communities surrounding this area was that the culverts and the mitigation infrastructure that developers said they would build, they never actually built. And people were really concerned about flooding affecting them downstream. So these are the type of cases that I'm really interested in looking at systematically across the US and seeing, what happened later. And this isn't just one niche story about one development in Houston. There's been over 1 million changes to the FEMA regulatory floodplain since 1985, and almost all of the changes requested, 86%, get approved. So this is a really common process in the US. And this actually came up recently in the news with the floods that happened in Central Texas, because Camp Mystic, if you remember this really horrible, tragic story, where I think it was like 27 girls from this camp actually died in the floodwaters, they had requested a letter of map change to FEMA because they had cabins that were in the floodway, and they requested that they be exempted from the floodway, 19 cabins, and they did this twice, one in 2013 and one in 2019. And they actually expanded the camp and had, engineering studies that supposedly backed that this change was legitimate. But what I want to do in my project is look at, and we know what happened, unfortunately, in Camp Mystic later. Was this a legitimate change? And for all of the times it's happened is across the US, how many Camp Mystic-like stories are there that we could uncover where there might be sort of hidden risks and mistakes that we could find? Wisconsin, for example, has had 17,666 letters of map change. So plenty we have to analyze here in our own state. And this graph just shows, these are called letters of map revision, the changes that have happened over time since 1985. Most of them are happening in rapidly urbanizing places in the US, like Texas, Florida, Colorado, Arizona, places where we've seen some growth. But we did put Wisconsin on this map to show that it is sort of part of this trend of these changes. So that project has just started, so I don't have results to show for it yet. We probably won't for another year, but we will be making this data publicly available for anyone to look at where the floodplain has changed anywhere in the US and the accompanying satellite maps that will make probably of around 10,000 floods that we'll be mapping in the US to do this analysis people could use for other purposes. Okay, so that's some of the data and analysis. Now I want to show some of the work that I'm doing outside of just the ivory tower in academia. First, I want to talk a little bit about the flood justice work that I'm doing in South Texas. And this is primarily with my PhD student, Lucas Belluri. He has, I want to promote always his US-Mexico Borderlands Bilingual podcast, if you're interested in this type of work further. And he works in this area in South Texas with a lot of informal urban development. They're called colonias. So these are communities that are built outside the zoned urban area, and they're chronically flooded for many, many reasons, dating back to environmental racism in the area, lack of drainage infrastructure built, rules and regulations of cities that do not want to incorporate colonias because they don't want to be saddled with the financing for having to provide drainage to these areas. So these places flood all of the time. And they flooded particularly badly in 2008 after Hurricane Dolly. And when residents in colonias started filling out their FEMA claims, almost everybody got denied. And people were really shocked and upset by this. And Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, which is a group of lawyers in the area, brought this case to court, So La Unión del Pueblo Entero, which is one of the community organizations in this area, said, hey, we think everybody's getting denied and there's something fishy going on here. And what the lawyers found was that FEMA had been training its staff in unofficial policies to deny people claims with the phrase deferred maintenance. So if you see, what that translates to is if you see somebody's floor damaged and you can't tell if they're just poor and they didn't upkeep their flooring, or if it's from a flood, write down deferred maintenance and we'll deny that claim. So FEMA got sued for doing this and they lost. Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid and Lupe actually won in court, and there was a cash settlement to households almost 10 years later. But you know, that's a long time for people to get justice. And so we thought, hey, if we can make flood maps from satellite imagery, could we get people recovery aid faster? How can we use the data we have to change this really unjust situation? So we co-developed with 5 community-based organizations in the region a project called Flujos, Flood Justice Utilizing Satellite Observation. And what we did is worked with them on theories of change of how could satellite data actually make a difference in flood injustice happening in your region. And then we made a historical database of flood maps with them, collected all of the important flood maps, digitized their lived experiences of flooding, used that to train a machine learning algorithm on satellites, showed them the maps and had them comment on them, and actually had them help co-design the tool together with us. And folks mainly wanted to use this for advocacy efforts in the area, increasing funding after recovery, focusing efforts on who's flooded and where should we be focusing our recovery and aid, another community empowerment work that they were doing. And so we released this tool about 6 months ago. The website is at the bottom. It's from my kind of former University of Arizona domain. It's fully bilingual. And it was actually used in March 2025 when there was large floods in the region by several groups for focusing long-term recovery, advocacy to county commissioners about places that got flooded. People are using it to write grants. And so we've seen active uptake and use of this tool. But I do want to show one kind of technical piece of how we incorporated people's lived experiences into the flood maps. And this is called an AI human in the loop. And we're actively working now to make this a more expanded and near real-time tool in the area. So what we do is we print off our satellite-derived flood maps and then show them to people, and people draw and say, hey, you missed flooding here. I actually think it didn't flood here and you got this wrong. And we use that to retrain our AI algorithm. And this is called fine-tuning of a convolutional neural network in artificial intelligence. And we can see real differences. So this is our previous flood map prediction in yellow. Once it was trained on resident experiences, we see a new flood map appearing in blue from the same event, and we can see big differences. We can see kind of these new areas of water that are picked up. Our first AI model wasn't detecting as a flood. So got a 10% increase in accuracy, but the real story here isn't just about increasing in accuracy. It's about how this type of process really built trust, I think, from both the community-based organizations and residents who participated in this process and came to understand, like, what can satellite maps really do and not do, and how should I be using them? And so that was maybe the larger benefit, I think, than just the increase in accuracy that we got. Okay, so we can make flood maps from satellite data, maybe to improve aid and recovery. But what about actually having financial tools to do something about recovery when you even if you knew exactly where to work and where the damage was? So much of the damage from flooding in the US is uninsured or underinsured. I think Western North Carolina and Hurricane Helene, it was like less than 1% of homes that were impacted had flood insurance. Hurricane Harvey in Houston also was actually really low penetrations of flood insurance. And so this is something that I've been working on also commercially with a company I started about 10 years ago called Floodbase. And I want to describe the type of flood insurance that we're doing if you're not familiar with it. So there is physical property exposed to flooding. And you can insure that with traditional insurance. It can be really expensive to do. You have lengthy in-person damage assessments when you do. This is called indemnity insurance in the traditional way. But then there's everything else that's not a building or a property. Business interruption, if you have to close your store and you can't open it, you have loss of service. Hospitals have loss of service from business interruption. You can have lost tax revenue as a municipality if a tourist area has to close, for example. And so traditional insurance doesn't cover those types of losses from flooding. And so one possible solution to that is parametric insurance. You can have a policy that gives you a cash payout as soon as floods occur. That's based on a direct satellite-based measurement of flooding. So you have a pre-written contract that says at threshold 1, 2, or 3, you get X, Y, or Z payout. And that's what parametric insurance is. And in order to make that possible, what my company Floodbase did was developed a type of flood monitoring that was continuous and near real time that you could both price an insurance policy from and pay out when you needed to. But we had to use more than satellites to do this. Even if you string together every single public satellite sensor ever in private ones, you don't get a perfect image from the flood. And so what we did is we used machine learning to combine both satellite data with physically based models, trained on satellite-based flood maps to get an image of what a flood would look like anywhere in the US every hour, even if you don't have a satellite image to produce it. I won't go into sort of more depth there, but we have a publication about that model if you're interested. I'm actually going to skip this for time because I want to get more to discussion and questions. But we were able to apply this model, for example, to map the floods in Central Texas for that Can't Miss It case I told about earlier, which was on the cover of the New York Times. And the reason is we can produce this data instantly. It's an algorithm that already exists in the cloud that automatically processes all of the data. So you don't have to wait to run a fancy flood model. And we ran this, I think, that just the morning after the Central Texas floods occurred. So since we have that technology, we can do things like insure municipalities. So I'm going to tell this one story of Fremont, California, and then I'll kind of end here with this sort of adaptation example. So all municipalities in California are required to buy flood insurance, but it only insures their municipal building. And for Fremont, their municipal building was on a hill, so it never paid out. But they had a really bad flood in 2017 that damaged public infrastructure and incurred significant costs. So they were looking for some kind of policy that would actually cover them for what they needed. So they bought a parametric insurance policy from Amwins and Alliant. This is backed with reinsurance by Swiss Re, and it's based on our data at Floodbase. And they get a payout if a certain percent, 8.7% of Fremont floods. They'll get a payout with this policy. There's a second city in California that's also bought one, and I have other examples of my company doing this around the world, but I wanted to go into depth in the Fremont case. And what's great about the parametric insurance payout is they can use it for whatever they want. They could fund school lunch programs, they could repair a road. The cash really has no restrictions from this payout that they get. And what we'll typically do for cities is show, if you had bought this policy today, what would it have looked like in the past? Let's look at all the floods historically, when this would have paid out, and how much of the policy limit would have paid out, so you can think about if this policy is worth it for you. I'm going to skip this other example for time. I had another example of how we're doing this with farmers in Colombia, but same idea. Parametric insurance, payout based on satellite data, makes it cheaper and more possible for farmers to have insurance who have never been able to have it before. In Colombia. So I'm going to conclude there. What I talked about today was how machine learning and satellite data can help us better understand where flood exposure is actually happening. We can combine satellite data with sort of other urban planning and policy documents to look deeper into who's shaping flood risk and changing urban areas that might be shaping it. In this case, real estate developers that I'm looking into in the United States. And we can also use satellite data for different types of adaptation, from environmental justice initiatives to new types of insurance that could be based on satellite. So thanks to all my collaborators, and I'm going to end there.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. I think we probably have a small enough group. If anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself, or if you're more comfortable, you can drop them in the chat and I'll read them out loud and ask.
Yeah, that was super interesting, Beth. And while we're waiting for other people to generate some questions, I was just curious about the letters of map revision and if they are ever submitted to expand areas that are in the floodplain. So we don't, I'm just wondering if the number of map revision requests could be pointing in different directions.
Yes. This is going to be a little hot off the press, but I'm going to show you a graph my postdoc made this morning looking at this. This is a little unvarnished, but it does happen in both directions. So this is a change map by state. So this is just since 2013. So this doesn't go all the way back to the year 2000, but this is the cumulative change area in floodplains. And what we see is, for example, here's Florida, there's green line, a lot of areas added to their special flood hazard area, which is like the 100-year floodplain in FEMA maps. So some places do add. I don't know specifically, we haven't highlighted these other states here, but it looks like there's probably about a dozen states that have added, but most have declined. And where we see the biggest declines actually in removing places from that area is California, here's Texas, Wisconsin is this brown light here. It looks like it has a little bit of decline. Colorado, and Arizona as well. And so we do see on the net more decline than we see additions, but it does vary by state, if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's like this so timely that you
Yeah.
that charted out. I think that that's really interesting. And then I think, the next thing to show that would be useful for understanding that is if you put it into acres or, cumulative acres, and compare it to how the flood, what you're mapping with your satellite and AI tools compares to the coverage area in terms
Yeah.
of if you're counting, do you count it in acres or how is that?
That map was meters squared, so I could put it in acres.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I'm just wondering what meant.
Oh, what's the right
Yeah,
unit?
we
I mean,
use.
you could count it in area, but you
Because I think,
you could
we
also
don't
count it in
necessarily think
people,
meter squared.
buildings, asset value. There's like a lot of ways to think about what's the important way to answer that question. Because it could be a really small area, but a densely populated neighborhood that has a huge impact versus a large area that floods that's like in a wetland or a park.
Mhm.
So probably thinking about exposure just beyond the area is important there too.
It looks like Shinyi has joined us.
I had a quick question about the Food Host program. In terms
Yeah.
of the community input at this current stage, what's the frequency that people are like reporting those markers that you were saying were kind of helping?
Yeah, so it's not continuous. We did like 6 workshops in different communities. We got about 200 residents that did that. And then twice we've had community-based organizations look at the map. So we've had like, maybe 8 to 10 interactions. We don't have like a
Mhm.
tool where people report per se.
Okay. And was it pretty like easy to get the people involved to report, or did it kind of take a lot of outreach to get them involved and kind of giving that input?
yeah, it takes a lot of outreach, you know? I mean, for lots of reasons. Like one is, you know, in this area specifically, a lot of folks are undocumented. And so there's a lot of kind of trust building that happens with community-based organizations. So we didn't like convene people to come. We paid community-based organizations who had a budget line item in the grant to do this work. And then people who showed up got gift cards as well. So we always pay everyone for their labor and data in this type of work and would only sort of work kind of with and through them. But I think beyond just like the money of like, you have to pay people to do this, there's also the trust building you have to do. So we had a lot of conversations about data sovereignty with the community-based organizations before doing this work, thinking about how did they want to use the data? Did they want that data to be shared on the website with others? Because as typically happens, these communities have a lot of research fatigue from getting studied all the time, or like engineers coming all the time from the state of Texas and getting paid millions of dollars to do an engineering study, asking them for their data, and then they never hear anything back or get any benefit from that. And so we had a lot of conversations about, you know, did they want to do this and how, and do they want to be sharing that data with other people, before we were able to kind of even engage in that work and decide that that was an important and useful thing to do. So yeah, it takes a lot of money and time. I mean, before we even started this project, we were probably on calls with the project partner for 2 years, formulating the idea. And like, I think we wrote maybe 8 grants before 2 got funded. And so yeah, it's definitely like a process. You really have to be committed to the vision, I think, in building a relationship and doing something. And it doesn't fit into like like a one project timeline. You know, you have to like dream a big thing and then find the money to do the dream.
Awesome. Then, sorry, real quick. And then was that grant, that final grant, was that the NSF grant or was that a different grant that was utilized in the end for that project?
So Flu House, what did we get money from? Google Google had a environmental justice fund. We got 50K from that. Climate change AI. We won a grant that was 150K. I used some internal money from Arizona that was 25K. One of the hardest things about Flucos is we couldn't use any federal funding because we were working with lawyers. And I don't think this is universally applied by every federal agency. But NASA, when NASA turned down our project for funding the first time, they were like, well, we can't fund you because these lawyers could then sue the federal government. And we know they have before, and we're not going to fund your projects. We're like, okay, we can't use any federal funds for this. And so we started putting together small pots of foundation money and internal money from the university to make it happen. So NSF did not fund that project. And they wouldn't have even in the Biden era, and they certainly wouldn't now. I have 2 NSF projects that had the word justice in them that were both terminated. So elsewhere for money.
Yeah, that's too bad. So in addition to the gift cards for the participants, did they
Mhm.
see, was there an actual difference in terms of them getting compensated from the map change, like for their properties that were flooded, or were they not directly impacted and harmed by a flood?
Oh, like if the people that we got data from, like, were they impacted by this March 2025 flood? I don't know. We haven't tracked like the 200 individuals, so I cannot say for sure. But the organizations that we work with use the new maps, but I don't know like if the new maps exactly added an area. I don't know. I haven't traced that entire chain.
Would that have to, in order for them to benefit from any kind of protections,
Mm.
would there need to be some change at the FEMA level or
Oh, okay. I got your question.
change?
So, yeah. Okay. So we just have this satellite-based flood history of what happened and where the water was. It is not incorporated into any official FEMA flood maps. FEMA doesn't recognize satellite data as like an official source of data that you could use to update a risk map. So I don't even think there's a process that like I even know of that could be possible to update a FEMA map. So our maps were used by local nonprofits who were doing relief work, Salvation Army, churches, local folks in the area. You can still get access to FEMA aid if you're not in FEMA's official flood map, but it's only through the individual housing assistance program, and the governor of your state has to declare a federal disaster to unlock that pot of money. One of the biggest problems for communities in the Rio Grande Valley is they can't get the governor of Texas to declare a disaster for their floods. Because politically they've been kind of more Democratic and left-leaning communities. That has changed recently, so the politics there might change a little bit. But also states typically have to match, not typically, states have to match a certain percent of FEMA dollars that get unlocked, and the state didn't want to spend on it, so they weren't declaring those disasters in many cases and unlocking that money. Sometimes they did, but anyway, maybe more than you wanted to know, but that's part of the advocacy piece actually for communities was, okay, when the governor doesn't declare a disaster, like let's take these flood maps to the media and, you know, push them to do it. Or oftentimes when the government isn't stepping in doing a recovery and it's really churches and local nonprofits doing the work, we can use these maps to do our own recovery efforts, which is what happened in March 2025. So we're a ways from the official, this data getting used, I think, in the official government process, but that would be great someday.
Eric.
Thanks, Beth. That was great to get more information on your really cool research approach that's kind of transdisciplinary and has this advocacy angle, and then you kind of go all the way to kind of enacting kind of the flood insurance option with the other work that you're doing. And the sticky issue that I've encountered is this idea of the removal of communities from risky areas, right? And I'm wondering how you are approaching that, because it sounds like a lot of what your work is just making more accurate kind of flood risk maps and kind of improving things from like an actuarial sense almost. But then obviously you have this flood justice component. And so it looked like some of the case studies you've been working on, there's like a community insurance component of it where you can kind of help people to get covered if they can't afford it individually. But I'm wondering where that starts to get in tension with communities that might be better off. Obviously, this is like culturally loaded to like uproot a community and move them, but there could be examples of where if now that decision is in the community's hands, does it make more sense to start moving them to less risky places? And like, how do you approach that from kind of your research and your flood insurance perspective?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because, flood insurance helps people stay in place and their properties get valued. And so you're reinforcing risk in a highly exposed area. And part of the idea, of insurance is that it just becomes more expensive and then people can't afford to live in places they shouldn't live. But that's not how it happens in reality. What's happened in reality with the National Flood Insurance Program is that the wealthiest people figure out how to game the system and get their house rebuilt 6 to 11 times. So if you look at sort of flood recovered properties in the US, those are some of the trends that you see, and does reinforce a lot of exposure that the American taxpayer pays for in the floodplain over and over again. And when with FEMA Risk Rating 2.0, where they updated maps and updated insurance rates, kind of to try to discourage what you're saying, Eric, of having more expensive flood insurance in more risky places, that was really hard because there were a lot of people in low and middle income communities that couldn't pay their premiums anymore. And so the idea of that price signal was to get people out of the floodplain. But the reality of people experiencing that is people losing their homes. So it's hard stuff. I mean, I think we have to have really hard conversations about what managed retreat can and should look like and fund it. Because if you don't get managed retreat, what you get and what we're getting now is unmanaged retreat of people having to leave when something gets destroyed and they can't repay it or they can't pay an insurance premium. So that is happening. And I think that's
Right.
not the answer. But there's also a lot of communities that want buyouts that cannot get them.
Yeah.
There is a buyout program in the US. It's incredibly expensive. Usually the county has to pay and match funding. And actually in the Rio Grande Valley where we work, there's lots of people who would like to move and get a buyout that do not want to live in a flood affected community. And they would love to be a part of that program. There's a lot of great research done. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It was a sociologist at UCLA who worked on Staten Island after Hurricane Sandy.
Was it this book?
Oh no, I love that book too.
Okay.
Liz Kozlov, Underwater's great, but Liz
Oh,
Kozlov
yeah.
wrote a book basically about the buyout program in Staten Island and all these people who would have loved a buyout and couldn't get one. So it happens both ways. People can't always access buyouts when they want them. And there really are people who would like to do managed
Yeah.
retreat and buyout. But there's also communities that would like to stay in place. And we have to have really hard questions about like who pays for that. Do we
Right.
force people to pay for that? Do we subsidize people's risk and to what degree? So I don't have like a good answer to that. But there are people who want to leave that can't, and we should be financing those folks, and they're not.
Yeah, totally. Thanks.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, Beth, and this is just has been a fantastic hour to get a little bit of introduction to all the different areas that you've been working on. It seems like you should probably be about twice the age you are, having done all those things. So really appreciate hearing about it, and I'd open it up for everyone to give you some appreciation of a round of applause before we close out.